Coming to get you, Barbara.
The Return of the Living Dead is a really interesting movie, and there's a lot to talk about here. Firstly, there's the title. If you didn't know any better, you'd think that it was a sequel to George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. After all, it's a natural title for a sequel, but there had already been a sequel, Dawn of the Dead, in 1978, and earlier in the same year, the third movie in the series, Day of the Dead, had come out. But while The Return of the Living Dead is not a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, it kind of started out as one, even though George A. Romero had nothing to do with it. The original Night of the Living Dead was co-written by a guy named John Russo. He wrote a sequel called Return of the Living Dead, but it wasn't a movie, it was a book. Since they both wrote the original movie, Russo got the rights to the Living Dead part, which is why the sequels were Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, rather than Dawn of the Living Dead and Day of the Living Dead. The movie, The Return of the Living Dead, is based on the book, allegedly. They optioned the rights to make a film out of the book, but the movie shares no characters or plot with the original, so basically they just bought the name. So even though The Return of the Living Dead's title sounds like a sequel, it's not. And as a matter of fact, it's the beginning of its own series, which has seen 5 movies so far. I think the creators of the movie knew that the title may be confusing, especially coming out only a few months after Day of the Dead, so they pretty much address it right at the beginning of the movie. But I'll get to that in a bit. The other interesting thing I wanted to talk about is the zombies. Get one of your friends and ask them to act like a zombie. There's a pretty good chance they'll start moaning and saying, "brains," and lunging around. It's considered one of the biggest zombie cliches ever, that zombies eat brains and that they announce it constantly. But would you believe this is the first movie to do this? That's the kind of impact it had. Before this, zombies killed people by eating them entirely, and before Romero, they would just tear people apart or beat them to death, or even use normal weapons. Most people don't seem to realize that The Return of the Living Dead invented the brain-eating zombie, but there you have it. Anyway, the movie starts off with these two guys, Frank and Freddy. Freddy is a new hire at a medical supply warehouse, and Frank is his boss. They have all sorts of fucked up shit there. A lot of it is normal, like prosthetics, wheelchairs, and skeletons. But there's also cadavers. Now, that may seem pretty normal, but it's not just human cadavers. They have dogs, too. But not entire dogs, just half. They call them split dogs, and they're bisected laterally. I've never heard of such a thing. I even Googled to see if there was such a thing, and there isn't. All I found was references to this movie and info about a band called Split Dogs. Anyway, Frank shows Freddy around, and seeing that Freddy gets a little weirded out by the corpses, he decides to tell him a secret that he's clearly dying to tell. He mentions the movie Night of the Living Dead and tells Freddy that it was based on true events that were covered up by the government. So right at the beginning, it addresses the connection to Night of the Living Dead. It's not a sequel, but it's sort of a homage. He claims that the zombie uprising was caused by a secret gas developed by the military to spray on marijuana. Yeah, I know that doesn't make much sense, but just go with it. Apparently Romero either worked for them or got word of it somehow, but upon threat he changed things around in the movie he made about it. Frank knows this because the zombies were captured and preserved in canisters, which the military accidentally shipped to them. Instead of calling the number stenciled on the side of the canisters and sending them back, they kept them in the warehouse basement. Frank goes on and on about how he thinks the military are a bunch of stupid fuck-ups, but then when he shows Freddy the canisters and Freddy nervously asks if they could leak or crack open, he says, "Oh, of course not. They're made by U.S. military engineers," and gives it a good smack, which of course breaks it. This all happens in the first 10 minutes of the movie, before the credits even, making you think that the movie is going to have a very fast pace, but actually it does build slowly, which is kind of interesting. The gas knocks Frank and Freddy out, and when they come to, they find the corpse missing, though they think it must have melted on exposure to the air or something. The gas from the canister got out and brings several things to life, including some pinned butterflies, a few split dogs, and a human cadaver in their freezer. The human zombie starts screaming and yelling and clawing at the door, so in a panic they call their boss Bert, and the three of them try to figure out what to do. Meanwhile, Freddy has a bunch of friends who are waiting for him to get off of work. It's kind of like the cast of Maniac Mansion or something. You got the punk guy, the crazy girl, the girlfriend, the nerd, and they all have stupid nicknames like Spider, Suicide, Scuzz, and Trash. To kill time waiting for Freddy to get off of work, they go hang out in this cemetery where Trash gets naked and starts dancing around. She never does put her clothes back on, which is hilarious. She's literally naked throughout the rest of the movie. There's also an interlude with a military officer who's been looking for the canisters. It doesn't really serve too much of a point other than setting up the ending, and it isn't really needed. It just shows that the guy is kind of a jerk to his wife, but by the end you nearly forget about it until they show the guy again. Anyway, Frank, Bert, and Freddy try to kill the zombie in the freezer, but they find that it doesn't die when you damage its brain like in the Romero films, and even after they completely dismember it into pieces, each piece is still moving independently. They gather up all the pieces and the split dogs and everything and take it all to the funeral home across the street where Bert's friend Ernie works. Yeah, Bert and Ernie. After what seems like ages, they convince him to let them use the crematorium to burn it all. They successfully burn the zombie, but the ashes somehow mix with a rain cloud and cause a breakout of acid rain. This causes Freddy's friends in the cemetery to freak out, especially the naked chick who's getting powdered with acid rain. But what's worse is that the rain seeps into the ground and starts reviving the dead bodies in the graveyard. So pretty soon there's zombies everywhere. The original zombie from the canister is also around, and after calling some paramedics for Frank and Freddy, who are getting sicker by the minute from their exposure to the gas, we find out that they're slowly turning into zombies also. Not only is this the first movie that had zombies eating brains, but it's also the first to have fast zombies and smart zombies. You can't really just walk away from these guys. They fucking chase you down, and they're just as fast as living people. And they're smart. When Freddy's girlfriend locks herself in a closet or a locker or something, one of the zombies uses a winch to wrench the door open. And then the zombies use teamwork and other tactics to overwhelm and surprise people so they can eat their brains. They even get on the radio and call for more paramedics, and later on more cops. It's like they're ordering food. The group manages to capture a zombie that is basically just the top half of a woman's skeleton, and they tie it down and interrogate it. They find out that it really, really hurts being dead. They can feel themselves rotting, and eating brains actually eases their pain, so it's like a drug that they're addicted to. The zombies are notoriously hard to kill, and the cast gets picked apart one by one. Eventually, Freddy becomes a zombie and starts trying to eat his girlfriend's brains, and Frank manages to kill himself by crawling into the crematorium before he can become a zombie. And most characters get killed and or turn into zombies, or both. In the end, the survivors finally get to a phone that works and call the military, and when the military finds out that there's another zombie outbreak, they don't fuck around. They hit the city with a nuclear artillery shell and blast everything to hell. And the end sets up the sequel, saying that although the zombies are gone, there was a bit of acid rain seeping into the ground. The Return of the Living Dead is a really fun movie, and you can't really think about it too much because there's a lot of shit that just doesn't make sense, like the zombies that are just bones but can walk around and even have eyes. And how do they eat brains anyway? They don't have stomachs. It would just fall out of them. But this isn't the kind of movie you overthink or analyze. It's just pure entertainment, so you kind of have to judge it as such. And it is highly entertaining, especially due to the special effects, which mostly use puppets and animatronics. The effects are really, really good for 1985, and the zombies are almost as creepy looking as the ones from Fulci's zombie films, just a lot more animated with more fluid movements. My only issue with the movie is one that's fairly common with 80s movies, is that it really dates itself with the reliance on 80s music, slang, and fashion, and the acting can be a bit uneven, as some characters are portrayed naturally and skillfully. Others, like Suicide and Trash, just come off as stereotypes. It's one of those movies that doesn't make a lot of sense if you stop and think about it, but that's not the point. Hell, most zombie movies make no sense anyway. Even Night of the Living Dead, they have no idea what causes the dead to come back, and they only theorize that it's caused by radiation, which is a pretty shaky premise after all. Like I said when I reviewed Zombie 2, when it comes to horror zombie films, it's not what you do, but how you do it. And for what it does, Return of the Living Dead does it well. It's highly entertaining and was extremely influential to how people think of zombies. It has its flaws, but it's good fun. I'll give The Return of the Living Dead a 7 out of a possible 10.